Well, this is probably the weirdest update I've ever had to do because I guess everyone took a break. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Okay, first off, when we look at the combat map, you may notice it's empty. Like, now I don't know if they haven't updated, but they clearly have. They're clearly updates from several hours ago. Now, normally you will see literally hundreds, even thousands of reports of Russian shelling dozens or hundreds of reports of Russian shelling across the entire front line. The Russians almost never let it up. Now, I think it's really probable, at least, that there simply is a gap in the reporting, given that Russian artillery almost never stops. But we would also see someone changing hands somewhere. And as you guys can see, there's really not that either. No offensives in Bakhmut, no offensive near Donetsk. And while I would say this is a reporting error, but War Mapper says the same thing. There's no changes to control at all. No changes to control at all in Bakhmut. Even the Deep State map says that, well, it's depicting some level of offense. There's no update for today. As of yesterday, the only real changes that we talked about were in Savote, and you can see it's pretty minor. It's actually listed as a small Russian counterattack near Andriivka. Why? Why do militaries do this? Well, we talked about earlier, usually when you don't want to stop operations if you can avoid it. The reason that I think you could, also I'm going to point out that even within the Russian campaign assessment, the only activity we're talking about is the increase of Ukrainian drone or rather the increase of Russian attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure. But even the Ukrainian air defenses have shot down every one of the 16 Russian drones. Now, we talked about this, that in some ways, this is emblematic of wars that go on and on and on, right? Each side is learning, and we're literally watching it in real time as these strikes, these drone and cruise missile strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure initially were devastating, with dozens and dozens, something like a majority of these cruise missiles getting through. Now it's a minority that actually make it to their targets. And in instances like this, the drones literally have a 0% success rate. And we see it too on the ground. If you were on the Patreon, on Friday, we did a reaction to two different footage, drone footage of attacks on Russian trench lines. And we could see that while some Russians still appear to be newly mobilized with very poor TTPs and a poor construction of their fighting position, other Russian units appear to be improving their ability to counter Ukrainian drone attacks themselves by improving their overhead cover of fighting positions and spending less and less time making their fighting positions more drone resistant, right? All of this, I think, is a combining to produce these effects where it's harder for both sides to take territory, right? And we're here to be a fair broker. You could see that Ukrainians are allegedly pushing near Kremenina and Savote, but we're not really seeing the breakthroughs or the movement that I think the Ukrainians were really hoping to see. And I say all this because the fighting has been unsustainably intense, and I've told people this, that this level of intensity in a conflict, it just can't be sustained. Again, I look back to perhaps we draw a comparison to the First World War, in which both sides, the level of casualties and intensity of combat in the first really, I think it was several weeks, was just at an unreal level of intensity. And that was a unique period of time where the industrialization of war was being fought using tactics of the pre-industrial Napoleonic era. And by the time tactics caught up to the industrialization, you saw a increasing difficulty in making tactically significant gains. Now, do I think that's the case here? My answer is maybe. We've talked about the fact that a lot of Russian soldiers don't have combat experience to draw on. They don't have significant amounts of training to draw on. And so they have a steeper learning curve than everyone else. But Russia has, in its sort of pretty cruel way, solved this problem as well, because they, in places like Bakhmut, newly mobilized soldiers are being sent on the most dangerous missions. They're doing these recon by fire, or rather recon by receiving fire, or simple frontal assaults, whereas second line experienced trained troops are held in reserve to exploit breakthroughs or to exploit when the mobilized troops find gaps in Russian lines. So in their way, the Russians are also preserving their combat power as best they can and preserving those troops who are best able to survive on this battlefield, as Ukraine is doing, right? By not launching major offensives to try to push the Russians out of Bakhmut, right? They are conserving their own combat power while inflicting Russian casualties. All of this means, since both sides have realized that they do not have the material or men to stage more major advances, you're going to see both sides become more disciplined fighters. I mean that in the sense of maybe more conservative operations. Now, NATO, especially if you're a NATO army, conservative operations are in some ways anathema to NATO tactics, right? NATO equipment, NATO doctrine, and NATO organizations oriented around the idea of a pretty lightning offense, right? You just cannot grind an enemy down using NATO tools. The supply chains can get really long. As we've talked about, there's some rumors that the factories, for example, that make HIMARS are actually already starting to see supply issues running out of rockets. And in the grand scheme of warfare, this has not been going on that long for an attritional war. But again, the idea of the HIMARS is sort of like what we saw, where it breaks up enemy supply lines, it prepares the battlefield for an offensive, and in the case of Kherson, the offensive never even had time to fully materialize because the preparations were so effective that the Russians simply withdrew on their own. So the Ukrainians are going to have to find a way to restart their offensive operations in a way that breaks and pushes Russian lines. This is easier said than done because, as we've discussed, Russian artillery, while not nearly as precise as the Ukrainians, can still break up major offensives, break up major formations. And so there's a huge question mark, even in my mind. I don't know what I would do if I was a Ukrainian commander, even if I were able to convince the Ukrainian, I'm going to say high command, the Ukrainian, their version of the Joint Chiefs of the Ministry of Defense, where I would attack in an effort to break through Russian lines with the existing Ukrainian forces. So again, I think we're seeing this operational pause as both sides consolidate and transition back onto the offense at a later date. I suspect that the Ukrainians may be the first to the punch. They may realize that, if they wait till the spring, the Russians will bring hundreds of thousands of more troops, even if many of them are poorly trained. Quantity has a quality all its own. So the Ukrainians probably need to find a way to consolidate and push harder. I think they have, if they're going to break through at Setove, they probably have about 24 hours to show good progress. before, you know, before I think Russia will be able to bring troops to reinforce that front. Is it possible that this is a feint like we saw where the Kherson offensive became the Kharkiv offensive to everyone's surprise? Maybe. Certainly possible. Anyway, guys, that is all I had. Of course, if you want to see those combat video breakdowns, the kind that I can't show you on YouTube, you want to do that on the Patreon. Thanks so much to my Lieutenant tier patrons. I know I have a few more Lieutenant tier patrons I have to update, but I appreciate every one of you guys. And the link to that's in the description. And have a good new year. Sincerely, I can't wait for what's in store for 2023. For the channel, right? Obviously, I'm hoping 2023 is the year we get a peace deal in Ukraine. But I'm excited to have whatever happens. I'm here for you guys, and I appreciate you being here for me. See you guys in the next year.